Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our London Region IWA webinar. So I'd like to just let you know that London Region IWA branch chairman met with CNRT about a couple of weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, to discuss their consultation on managing boats on London's busy waterways. The current stage of that is an engagement exercise with all sorts of different people, including all of ourselves. And I'm delighted that Matthew, who is their national boating manager, very kindly at that meeting agreed to do an extra webinar for our viewers tonight, and is going to explain the different questions that are going to be considered as part of that engagement exercise. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Matthew and very much look forward to your presentation. So over to you, Matthew. Thank you.
Thank you, Libby, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight. It's great that so many people come along to hear me. I hope you'll find it interesting, and I also hope you'll have lots of questions and comments as well. So as Libby said, I'm the National Boating Manager for the Canal River Trust, and I'm leading this work looking at how we manage boats on London's busy waterways. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the background and the numbers and the challenges that we're facing, and what we're doing at this current stage, and how we're setting out a proposal, or will set out a proposal, and how the timescale for the work that we're leading. So just to start with, just talk a little bit about the boat numbers in London. So we have seen, as many of you will be aware, a very large increase in boat numbers since 2010. So we've actually seen a doubling of boat numbers between 2010 and 2019. I will touch on 2020 in a little while as well. And that's obviously brought serious challenges. When we look in more detail at the numbers, we've actually seen that the biggest growth in those boats has actually been from boats without home mooring, so the continuous cruiser boats. So they've risen by over 400% in that time frame. We have seen an increase in boat numbers with a home mooring as well, but that's only been around a 20% increase. So it's definitely the drive has been boats without home mooring, and I'll talk a little bit about the challenges that brings for us. So our national boat count happens every year in March, and this is when the licensing teams go out, the rangers and the licensed support officers, and they literally count during March every boat on our waterway. And we do this to establish how many boats have a license on the waterway or on the water at that time. And we've done this for quite a long time, so we've got data going back to 2010 that is very robust. And you'll see in this slide that the figures on the bottom, you can see them increasing since 2010. So we've gone from 2,100 boats to over 4,000 in 2019. Just to highlight 2020, so it would appear when you look at the national boat count figures that the numbers have gone down slightly. But of course, in March, we were experiencing the start of the COVID pandemic, and in London that was hitting a little earlier than the rest of the country, and we had some sickness in our teams as well. So although we covered most of the waterway, there were some areas where we didn't get the count completed. Now that was fine in terms of a sample to establish how many boats had a valid license. It was a big enough sample, so it was perfectly valid, but it's not an absolute count of every boat. So a hint of caution, we don't think the boat numbers have gone down slightly, and that probably explains it. Just to highlight as well, when we talk about London, this context, we're talking about what was the old London waterway region. So we've matched these figures to that boundary, because we clearly had a boundary change in 2018 where we went from London to London and the southeast. So for this, we're talking about the Grand Union, Springfield to Brentford, the Slough Arm, Paddington Arm, Regents, Hertford Union, Limehouse Cut, the Lee and the Stort. So that's the area we class as London. So as I say, we think the 2020 figures actually isn't a reflection of what's on the ground, because we've also looked at the boat count data that we capture every week in London. We do sightings as part of monitoring the boat movements for the continuous cruiser requirements. And we've actually looked at the boat sighting we took in January, February and September from 2019 and 2020. We didn't actually have any boat count sightings happening in the summer and from spring onwards because of the lockdown. But when we look at those sightings where we did take a good boat sighting data, they actually suggest we aren't seeing fewer boats in London. We're actually seeing more boats as part of our sighting. So again, it makes us think that actually the boat numbers have not gone down in London. They certainly aren't rising at the rate they maybe were from 2010 to 2015, but we have seen a continual rise ever since. But obviously having more boats on the waterway does have some benefits. So certainly in London, we've got more activity on the water. Certainly more boats means there's more people around and more surveillance, and there's parts of the London waterways where maybe 10 years ago people wouldn't have felt as comfortable visiting as they do now, because they feel they are safer, they feel safer. So there's some positives. And of course, more boats means more boat licensing income. But it's important to point out that the licensing income we get is only a portion of the money we need to maintain the waterways. So boat licensing contributes about 20% of the cost the trust spends on managing and maintaining the waterways. So although that increase is welcome, it isn't the full, it doesn't cover the whole cost. It's only a part of the cost that we incur. And the challenges, of course, with the growth in boat numbers we've seen are obvious for some of the, if you've visited London and seen, in some places, the most obvious thing is the space for mooring. So towpath mooring space is under a lot of pressure in some areas, high demand, and lots of places where boats are double or sometimes even triple moored in the busy areas. And we've got increased demand for customer service facilities. Although we don't require boaters to tell us what they're using their boat for when they actually license, through the boat surveys we do know that in London we have a higher portion of boaters using their boats as their home. So it's around 60%, just over 60% of boaters are telling us that in London it's their primary residence. When you compare that with what the national figure is, it's only about 23%. So it's quite a big change. And of course, if your boat is your home, then you inevitably need access to those customer service type facilities, the water, the waste, pump outs, etc. So there is increased pressure because there's more people living on their boats there. And then obviously with a big increase in continuous cruisers, which have to move around, then there's clearly more wear and tear on the infrastructure, on the locks, etc. So there's some of the challenges we're facing with growth in boat numbers. In 2018, we actually published our London mooring strategy, which was developed as a response to the growth in boat numbers that we'd seen then. But when we published that, we were clear that if we saw continued growth or high numbers of boats, we would have to look at additional measures to manage the waterways in London. And that's what we're doing now. So this isn't about replacing the mooring strategy. That's something we're committed to delivering. But this is really about future-proofing going forward in terms of how we manage what potentially could be further growth in boat numbers in London. So that's what we're starting that process to look at now. So why do we need to manage boat numbers in busy areas? As I said, the most obvious thing that you see is the space to moor. This isn't an uncommon sight, particularly in central London, and increasingly in some other parts on the Lee as well, where you will have long lines of moored boats, and in many cases there'll be double or triple moored boats as well. And if we get more boats growing in London, the numbers, then there are implications in terms of navigation, how it would become more difficult for boaters who are travelling through London or visiting London to be able to navigate with, to be able to moor up as a part of that. We're likely to see even more double or triple mooring, which potentially could cause issues for navigation. And we'll see an even greater pressure on the facilities which are already experiencing a very high level of use, certainly a higher level of use than they were probably intended for originally. And of course, we've also seen increases in other demands on the waterways, both for recreational use on the towpath or for other activities like canoeing or kayaking, stand-up paddleboards, for angling. So potentially there's a risk of greater conflict between boaters and other waterway users if we see an increasing number of boats in London. So we need to just work out how we're going to make sure there is mooring space to enable navigation safely and for visiting boats who want to visit London, how we prevent damage, of course, the infrastructure, partly as a result of increased usage. How do we maintain safe navigation, and how do we make sure we've got enough staff or volunteers to meet the customer demand from the increased numbers of boats and boaters we're seeing in London. We also want to make sure that when you visit London, it's a great waterway experience. Unfortunately, at the moment, that isn't always the thing you see when you're visiting London. It is harder to make sure it's a great experience when there's been a significant increase in boat numbers. So both in terms of maintaining and the infrastructure and the facilities, there's challenges there for us. But also we know from the surveys we do that the boaters in London themselves are generally not very satisfied either. So we want to improve the experience for everybody who's visiting or using the London waterways. At the moment, boaters give us a very low score for maintenance and their experience, and they wouldn't recommend the waterways to others. So those are things we want to turn around. We want to see those improve. And alongside the scores we get from our boater surveys, we also are seeing an increased number of customer complaints and issues reported to our customer service teams. So there are genuinely issues we need to address in terms of improving the experience for boaters and everybody. And we know as well from boaters who've either visited London or those who haven't, that those who have, some of them tell us they won't go back. They haven't had a great experience. It's put them off visiting London. Or there are some who won't even attempt to visit London because they believe it's a no-go area. They've heard horror stories and don't want to visit London on their boats. And that's a shame, because London is a great place to visit. It's a great place to go boating, and we don't want anyone to feel that they're excluded from visiting London on their boats. So how do we make sure we can improve the mooring provision, provide the appropriate facilities where they're needed, make sure towpaths are in good condition, maintained, and how do we address issues that people see, partly as a result of increased demand, so things like fly tipping, bins that are overflowing. How do we try and prevent those things from happening as well? And then we also need to think about other things that people are saying they want in London, like charging points for electricity. So there's lots of things we need to address to make sure we can improve the waterway experience for people boating in London. And of course, the waterways in London are a great resource. They're a historic asset, and they've been around for 200 plus years, and we want to make sure they're around for a lot longer. So we need to address these pressures on them to make sure they can be around and they're looked after for that future use. So as I said earlier, although we've seen an increase in the boat licensing income, it is only part of the cost we spend on maintaining the waterway. So the other 80% that comes through things like the government grant, the money we get from investments, return on the trust investments, from charitable donations, from funding from utility companies that use the towpaths for cables and stuff, all that income, that other 80%, we haven't seen the same increase as we have in the 20% that comes from boat licensing. So there is a finite amount of money to address these challenges. And we need to make sure that we can do that sustainably going forward, because if we don't address this, then the risk is that the experience gets worse, we can't maintain the waterway, and we need to make sure we can do that both in terms of the facilities, the day-to-day repairs, the larger planned maintenance, and the staff that we need to manage the busy areas and respond to those increased levels of customer inquiries and comments. So these are the questions we need to ask. How do we make sure the historic structures are maintained and can withstand that increased use? How do we ensure we can tackle those perpetual issues that we see, such as the weed? How do we make sure facilities are available, but not just available, they're not vandalized? So can we make them more robust? Because there's nothing more frustrating for boaters than turning up at a facility and finding it's broken or been vandalized. So we need to make them be able to withstand the heavy use that they get. And how do we make sure we manage those competing demands on the waterway? So we know there's an increased number of boaters, but we're also seeing more people use the towpaths. And then there's the issues of how do we balance the needs of wildlife and of the historic structures, and how do we maintain those? There are many competing demands that we have to think about in the context of the growth in boat numbers that we've seen. But there are some constraints in terms of how we manage boat numbers in London, some things that we can't do. So legally, we have very limited powers to refuse a boat license, provided it meets the requirement, has insurance, the boat safety certificate. We can't simply say that there's too many boat numbers. That is not a valid ground to refuse a boat license. So that's something we can't do. And of course, boats aren't required to have a permanent mooring. So if boats choose to continuously cruise, they are entitled to do that, provided they follow the guidance. They move every 14 days, they maintain their range of movement. So we can't geographically say you can't go in some areas, providing they follow the guidance for boaters without a home mooring. And of course, in the legislation, if you only want to keep your boat on the river, then you're entitled to the river-only discount. So you only pay 60% of the full license. And certainly in the where we've seen the growth greatest in London, central London, and then East London is the second highest growth. And partly that may be because people are choosing only to stay on the river because it's a lower cost of license. So that we cannot change that. That's in the legislation and people are entitled to that, providing this down the river. The other thing that we can't do is issue fines. We have no powers in our governing acts to issue fines, in the sense that a parking attendant can issue a fine. We can apply charges for certain things. It's loosely defined as services and facilities, so we can apply charges, but we can't issue fines. And as I've highlighted, we have a finite amount of resources to manage and improve the waterways in London. So that's always going to be a challenge, much more we'd like to do than we have the resources available to do. The other constraint on us is land ownership. So while the Trust owns the waterway generally and the towpath and a stretch on the offside, we don't own most of the land that is adjacent to our waterways. So that offers some constraints to us, particularly if we're trying to put in new mooring facilities or new boater facilities, because often we will require permission from landowners to do that. And if it's not our land, it's entirely at their discretion as whether they will give permission. So we will also need to consider factors about access to service those things. So if it's a mooring site, then obviously people need to be able to get on and off their mooring site from land as well. And if it's facilities, we need to think about whether we need to surface, whether that's bins or it might be tanks, or we also need to consider that we can connect into services. So although there may be sites where we would like to put new moorings or new facilities, there are some constraints on how we're able to do that. And as a trust, we're clearly trying to ensure that the waterways are there to benefit everybody's well-being. And so we do want the waterways to be available for everyone to use. So boaters, of course, are very heart of our work, but we need to balance the needs fairly between other users as well. The waterways in London were never designed for continuous lines of moored boats. And so there needs to be space where people can get close to the water, whether they want to feed the ducks or just walk by the water. So there's a balance that needs to be struck in the work we do. So I mentioned the mooring strategy that we published in 2018, which set out how we would make a number of improvements to manage mooring space in London. And since we published that, we have put in additional mooring rings. We've put in additional refuse sites and water points and some additional facilities. We've also reviewed some of the short stay visitor moorings daytimes and introduced a second pre-bookable visitor mooring site at Paddington. But we have got quite a bit more to do in the mooring strategy, which we're working to get completed in the next financial year, with further water points planned and additional waste facilities. We're introducing a water safety zone on the River Lee. So there are two sections, one above Tottenham Lock and one around Broxbourne, which have very high usage of rowing and other unpowered water sports use. So this is about making sure the water is safe to navigate in those spaces. So limiting places where you can have double mooring or single mooring, and also making sure people aren't mooring in unsafe places on bends or under bridge holes. So that's what the water safety zone is looking to do. We've also been installing the eco mooring zone in Islington, which is a pilot where we are introducing electricity bollards on the two visitor mooring sections on either side of the Islington tunnel. So this should go live in January. For those sites, you will book to use the site and you will pay for the electricity. There's not a charge for staying, but it does require pre-booking. And as part of that, we're encouraging people to make sure they limit their use of their generators and engines, so they shouldn't be using them unless they're moving off, because there is access to electricity, and it's generally about sort of reducing emissions from boats in those areas. Some of you may know that section, just the geography of the canal there in its cutting can cause issues around smoke or pollution hanging around. So it's part of a pilot that's been partly funded by DEFRA and partly funded by Islington Council to try and clean up the air quality in that area, and also provide a mooring site with electricity for boaters to use. We have some additional pre-bookable mooring sites in the mooring strategy. So on the River Lee, on the Limehouse Cut, and at King's Cross. So those are also scheduled to be put in. And we're, in addition to the mooring strategy, we're also working with some of the developers, some of the large sites adjacent to the London waterways, which are going to be developed over the next few years to make sure we can try and get boater facilities into those locations. So in West London at Old Oak Park Royale, that the first phase of that is starting to come on stream in the next few years. We're very hopeful that the early part of that will include some boater facilities. Another scheme in West London is at Greenford Quays, which has already had part of it constructed. And that does have, as part of that development, some long-term mooring. And for that, they have put in facilities for those boats. They're not actually letting that mooring space yet. So we're trying to negotiate that we can have access for boaters to the facilities there. And then in East London, further up the River Lee, there's big development around Meridian Water, which again, it's quite a long-term scheme that, but we're also hopeful that we will get additional boater facilities into that mooring scheme. But even when we've done all of that work in the London mooring strategy, London still by far has the highest demand in terms of boat number use of any of our waterways. And if boat numbers, even if they just remain high without the same continued trajectory of growth, we do have to think about how we manage that space. And given the constraints on what we can do in terms of controlling boat numbers, we need to think of some way to make sure that if there is further growth, we can manage the water space safely and fairly. And so that's really what we're looking at now as part of this work. We have to mention COVID-19 because clearly it's been such a big impact on everybody this year. I know that we've heard from some people whose perceptions is that, you know, it will change London completely. It will change the use of the waterways in London with boats moving out. And there was certainly some people felt that when the lockdown started, there was a mass exodus of boats in London. I have to say that hasn't been reflected in what we've seen in our boat sightings. So as I highlighted earlier, we still have very high numbers of boats on the waterway in London. Where we might have seen some change is maybe a slight reduction in central area, but boats not moving out of London completely. They may be moving a little bit east and a little bit west. We won't know what the long-term impact is for quite a while, but we are monitoring on a monthly basis to see if there's any change. But even if we see a reduction in boats, say of 10 or 20%, we're still at very high numbers compared to 2010. So we still believe we need to do this work to make sure we can manage the waterways going forward in London with very high numbers. So the first stage we're doing now, which we started in October and it runs through to the new year, is getting people's views on both the impact on you and how you would manage the waterways to address the challenges that we're facing. So we've run a number of stakeholder engagement sessions over the last few weeks. We've done 12 so far online, and we have some more coming up next week and this week and in the new year as well. So there's really a chance to ask people's views and get their input. We're also running an online survey at the same time, which is asking people what would the impact be on you if there is continued significant growth in boat numbers in London? What would you do to manage boat numbers in busy areas? And how could you help contribute to managing boat numbers in busy areas? So we're keen to hear from boaters, but also other stakeholders. So whether that's towpath users, other users of the waterway, whether it's for angling or rowing or other recreational use, also residents, and we're engaging with the London boroughs and the Mayor's office as well, because we think we need everybody's contribution to help us find a way to manage the busy waterways in London going forward. So this is my final slide, just to remind people that the first stage runs until the 8th of January. After that, we will be looking to develop a proposal, and we're probably going to engage some more people in some more focused work looking at options before we publish a final proposal in the new year, and then there would be a formal consultation. So at the moment we're asking for views and keen to hear people's comments and questions, but there will be a stage where people can formally comment on the proposal we put forward. We're intending then to hopefully get a pilot in place in the summer to test that proposal. So that's where you can find out more on the canalrivertrust.org.uk/busy London web page. So that's my last slide, and I can take a drink of water, and I'm happy to answer some of the questions that you might have posed during the presentation.
Thank you very much, Matthew. We have quite a few questions, and I'll just one from Ivor Kaplan. As a Midlands boater regularly visiting London, I can confirm the perception here that it is becoming a no-go area and boating there is not a good experience. Can you look at how to make us feel welcome there? E.g. with a welcome station, say at Bulls Bridge, giving information on moorings and services, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good suggestion. I think certainly the things that people have told me, as well as the things we're doing in central London, we need to think about the people travelling in from further out in the outer parts of London. So having sort of gateway points where people are heading in would be a really a useful suggestion. We've already got volunteer teams in different parts of the waterway and further out of London. So welcome stations is certainly something we can look at for sure.
Thank you. Philippa Alston asks, have you considered seeking a change to legislation to give you or others more powers to deal with some of the problems?
So this has been considered quite a lot for many different reasons, not specifically the London work, but certainly, it has been mulled over, I'm sure, by trustees and senior executive members in the trust. I think the position we have is that to get changed legislation would take many years, and particularly in the current climate, it is not, unfortunately, seen as a high priority compared to some of the other pressing issues that the government might have. So I think it'd be a very slim chance to get change of legislation. And the other thing to bear in mind is that, if we did succeed in getting Parliament to look at changing legislation, there is no guarantee that a change in legislation actually was an improvement on what we have. So it is imperfect. I think, as I've highlighted, there are limitations in what we have, but there's certainly no guarantee that if Parliament looked at it again, we would have anything that was clearer, and it could be possibly worse. So I think the short answer is I don't think that's a realistic prospect at the moment. But if it was looked at, I know that when there was more active discussion about whether the Environment Agency waters would merge with the Canal River Trust, a lot of people thought, well, that would have to go through legislation, and that could be an opportunity to look at this issue. But that seems to have rescinded that opportunity at the moment. So I don't think we realistically think we can wait for legislation to solve this problem.
There's just been a comment from Roger Stocker to say that the middle levels managed to change legislation.
They did.
And why not give it a try?
Well, I think the mid-levels was a bit slightly different scenario because they had no control over boat numbers. So I think that it was a simpler ask to bring something in. I think the question that we would be asked, what do we want to change it to? And there are many different views on that. Some people who would like to see it even less restrictive, and some people who like to see it more restrictive. And as I say, if you start that debate up, you don't know which way it will go in Parliament. But yeah, it's a fair point. It has been done. That was done under a private bill, I think, the mid-level commissions.
Another question from Andrew Denny. Is there likely to be any change from 14-day to 7-day or 48-hour in central London to make it easier to find moorings?
Yeah, so I think that's certainly something that is within the scope. Looking at stay times, because that can be changed. That is something we can do already. So yes, that is within the scope of this bit of work.
Right. Now, this is come through anonymously. We're on the River Way and now never venture onto Grand Union without good reason. Every trip confirms why. Unrepaired damage, limited mooring, and more rubbish in the water than ever. Not all of this is CRT's fault or responsibility. What are you doing to rebalance spending towards the region that is significantly greater use than others? And what are you doing to deal with the unhelpful and antisocial behaviour of boaters?
Yes, there's lots of questions in that. So I think, as I highlighted in the kind of talk about experience, we know it isn't great for some people when they visit London. In terms of the spend, as I highlighted, the money we get, obviously as a trust, we're a national body, we look after the whole waterway. So all of our money goes into a central pot. We don't ring fence by regions at the moment. So we allocate that funding based on asset assessment and where the money is prioritized based on where the need is greatest. So that means, if there are a greater need in another region to invest in assets or improvements, that's where it goes. But it does mean that we do assess and prioritize every asset. The money we get from boat licensing is a portion of the income we get. So we do recognize that at the moment there is an issue about how we sustainably manage and maintain and improve the waterways in London, and we have to think about that seriously, about how do we get that investment in, because it's clearly needed, and we can't address some of these challenges unless we have a better way of funding and managing those things. So we haven't got a proposal yet, but it's certainly something we're considering in terms of how do we fund the necessary improvements and also additional things to manage some of the issues you've mentioned, whether that's people misusing or dumping rubbish or the graffiti that was highlighted on those things. At the moment, we in an ideal world, we'd have many more people on the towpath, many more people out offering that first-hand customer service experience for you, where you can speak to, who can keep an eye and sort of really own their patches. But at the moment, we're rather stretched, as you probably can imagine. So we have to think about how do we provide that service and meet that demand sustainably as part of how we fund it. That's what I mentioned we can't fine, we can apply certain services and charges, and that is part of what we will look at as part of considering a proposal for London, as whether that could then go back into investing and improving the areas where we've got issues and challenges.
Thank you. There's a question here from Roger Stocker about residential moorings. How many new residential moorings have been created over the last 10 years in the old London region area? How many residential moorings are there in the old London region?
So the short answer is not many. I can't give you an absolute figure, but I think there's around about 10, and they're not mostly in Docklands actually, where we've managed to get them. One of the challenges we face is actually getting permission for residential moorings. So it's obviously a planning process when you go through. For leisure moorings, we can put them in without going for a planning permission. For residential, you need full planning permission. There isn't always a lot of enthusiasm to do that, frustratingly. And that's one of the challenges. So often we will start off putting in leisure moorings because we can get them in. And then try, if we can, to get them made residential at a later point. In terms of overall numbers, we don't provide most of the moorings nationally. We do have a slightly higher proportion in London, but many of the moorings are provided by private providers, offline marinas, for example, on the Lee, and other operators. There is a challenge there because, quite frankly, we all know that some of those leisure moorings are used by people who live on their boats. And I think it would be really helpful if there was an honest discussion with some of the boroughs and the planning authorities about the need for residential mooring in some areas, because there clearly is a need for residential mooring. Partly, as I highlighted, we've seen more people live on their boats, but we're seeing them without moorings. And that's adding to the pressure we're facing on the facilities and the services we provide. So it's a bit of a roundabout way of saying not many additional moorings have been provided, often not because there isn't a will by us to do it, but it's the challenges we face from other people. And there is also a limit to how much space there is suitable for more permanent moorings in London. I know, looking at this with our waterside mooring team, we've probably identified about 35 berths that we could fit in London. So it's not going to make a huge impact in the context of the numbers we've got.
Right. Still on the subject of residential, Izzy Turner says there used to be a residential boat license which cost more. Could this be reinstated?
So you have to excuse my knowledge of that. I'm not familiar with a residential boat license. We do have the houseboat certificate. So that's for where you've got more of a floating structure that is not so much of a boat, but a house that floats on water. I would have to look into the residential license, but it's not something I've come across in my time at the Trust. So it's a bit of it's a new one to me. So thanks for flagging it up. I'll happy to look at it.
Certainly, I'm more familiar with it relating to the residential mooring costs than the actual license costs. But Douglas Nethercleft asks or suggests, I strongly suggest the Trust imposes a high facility usage charge for boats permanently in the London area. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so I mean, services and charges for services and facilities is certainly something that is within the scope of what we could do. and so we'll look at that. I mean, in the London mooring strategy, we've identified quite a lot of additional facilities that we want to put in. But to just put some of that in context, if we want to add an additional waste site, it normally costs us around £10,000 to get that waste site in, plus annually £10,000 to service that onto the contract. So, it's every additional facility you put in, it adds up to quite a significant amount of money, and it's considerably more for water and waste and wet waste, and we have to also negotiate with some of the providers. So yes, there's a lot of cost to put those in. We think there's a need to put them in, but you're right, we need to think about how we fund that, and charges is an option because it is something we can do under our legislation.
Right. There's another one here about visiting London and the difficulty mooring as you go through, from Malcolm Bridge. He says, I've visited London from the north most years for at least the last 10, and can confirm that mooring in London has now become so difficult that it is possible I will not visit again. Why does the Trust seem to take the simple option of making more moorings 24 or 48 hours only, so that we don't have to put in 10-hour days to get from west of Little Venice to above Tottenham on the River Lee?
Mm-hmm. So we aren't ruling that out. Certainly, in the mooring strategy, we actually suggested some of the moorings would reduce from 7 days to 48 hours. So that's some work that is still to happen. I think what's crucial to this, though, is to make sure that we enforce that effectively. At the moment, because we have no powers to fine, that's a challenge for us. Historically, you will, I'm sure, have seen in many places the sort of £25 overstay charge that you see tiles on different visitor moorings. Now, realistically, in places like London, that isn't much of a disincentive, unfortunately, at the moment. When we brought in changes in some parts of London, so when the Olympic Loop opened, that is actually a no mooring anywhere in the Olympic Loop, partly for security reasons related to requirements that the Legacy Commission that managed the Olympic Park put in place, but also it's not very suited, and there's certain flood channel issues. But if you do moor there's actually a charge of £150, and it's actually working very effectively as a disincentive. So one thing we could look at is reviewing that overstay charge, because £25 probably was quite a lot of money in 1969. Not so much money in central London now. So, that's part of what we will look at. So yes, to shorter stay, possibly in some areas, but also we need to make sure we manage it. It's no good just expecting it to self-manage when we have quite so many boats in those areas.
Thank you. I just noticed in the chat that Mike Stimpson has come up with a comment about the residential licenses. He said, planning for residential moorings results in the local council being responsible for rehousing if the boat is not able to be lived on. And then he says, in 1975, a residential license cost twice a leisure license. The problem BWB faced was enforcement. How do you prove a boat is being lived on?
Yeah, so it comes very much down to it's absolutely the point. To have a residential mooring, you've got to have planning permission for it, and there is a higher price still for a residential mooring. We get more income, certainly on the moorings that we have that are residential. In terms of proving boats are, if they're on a leisure mooring and they're being lived on, it is actually it's a planning authority that has to investigate that. If they decide to take action, they could take action against the boater, but they could also take action against the mooring provider. So that might be it might be a private operator. But I think the reality is most planning authorities are pretty stretched, and they don't see this as a priority. So it might be a priority for us, or an issue that's affecting us more. For them, it's probably one of a long list of issues that falls pretty low down their pecking order, unfortunately.
Can I just remind people to put their questions in the Q&A and not in the chat? We have a question from David McCarthy. You say boaters' fees provide 20% of CRT expenses. If there were no private license paying boats and everything else was the same, roughly how would that affect CRT costs? Bearing in mind the supervisory effect of boaters no longer being in a location might lead to increased vandalism.
Yeah. So, clearly there are things that boaters bring that are not directly linked to the financial payment you make for your license. So I think we absolutely recognise that. That's the same also for the people who use the waterway as well. So, there's lots that we can't be calculated on a finance basis. In terms of the breakdown, we've actually published a boater report. So if you go to our website and put in /boaters report, we've actually published 3 now, which gives you more detail on how that income breaks down. We get around £21 million from licence income nationally, which is about 10%. When we add in the other charges we get for moorings and other boating related income, it's about 40 million in total. But you can see as a portion of what we spend, that is only, for every £1 we get from boating income, we're spending another £4 to maintain and manage the waterways. So, I can't really go into the detail, but please do have a look at the boat report. It will give you much more detail on that income and expenditure and some of the things we spend the money on.
Thank you. Questions are coming thick and fast. We have another one from Graham Russell. What percentage of the 2,146 CC boats in 2019 actually move every 14 days in strict accordance with CRT's terms and conditions? These are terms and conditions which every boater agree to when they buy a license. If all CCs move every 40 days, then this would cause tremendous ongoing damage to the canal's asset.
So it might surprise you, but most boats do move. They just don't necessarily move very far. And obviously they don't have to move very far. There's no prescribed distance in terms of where you have to move every 14 days. The legislation says you have to move to another place, which we can't specify what that means. The legislation doesn't allow us to do that. But they do move. There is quite a high level of movement. It's just that maybe, how could you describe it, as maybe shuffling a bit rather than navigating long distances. So, the fact that the boats have to move means that there will be wear and tear on the infrastructure, but that's an issue that we have to keep the navigation open. So it is a challenge, but as I say, most boats do move already. It's just, I think the perception is that they don't, because they just kind of move around a bit, and you'll still see continuous lines of moored boats, even though they have moved. They've swapped places perhaps, or just moved a little way. And we do have, the other thing to highlight is we do have a higher license evasion rate in London than in other parts of the country. So our license evasion rate is the highest in London and the South East. So that is an extra challenge for the licence support officers in London, where we have to put extra resource into following up cases where boats are not licensed.
John Sericold asks, have you looked at periods of ownership in the licence data? I hear tell that there's a significant minority of liveaboards who manage only 1 or 2 winters.
So yes, we have looked at this. It's interesting. There's a couple of things that are quite interesting about London. So from the boater survey data we do, the demographic in London is quite a lot younger than other parts of our waterway. So a much higher proportion, about 60%, are sort of 50 and below. And the other thing that looking at the licensing data tells us that there does seem to be a pattern of a fairly high turnover every 3 years of license of a boat. So that suggests that quite a lot of people might be living on their boat because it's somewhere that's relatively affordable to live, perhaps. Not necessarily that they've bought into it because they've always wanted to be a boater and that's the lifestyle they're buying into. There clearly are people who are in that position in London, who want to live on the water and will maintain their boat for a long period of time. But we do have a fairly high churn rate, sort of 3 years, there's quite a lot of churn.
Paul Strudwick asks, with 3 abreast moorings, have you considered the fire risk?
Mm-hmm. Hello, Paul. Yes, I know this has come up quite a lot. There is clearly concern about whether boats are, if there is a fire on a boat and it spreads, then if you've got a lot of boats moored close together, then there's a risk of that. So it is something we consider, but we also look at where there have been incidents when we look at the risks, and we actually haven't. Well, you might say this is more luck than judgment, but we haven't had relatively few numbers of incidents in London. But yeah, of course, it is a factor that we'll have to consider, just as we consider safety for navigation purposes. There are issues around safety, and that's where we might have to work with other partners like the fire and rescue services in London and get their input.
There is quite a lot of work going on water on London and the Thames. There's a water strategy safety group forum that includes a member of CNRT and myself and the fire brigade and other people. But it is a big worry. Dave Chapman says, given the volume of boats and lack of facilities, there must be a risk to water quality. What level of testing is carried out?
So yes, that's really a question for one of our ecologists, so I can't give you the detail. We do carry out water quality tests in London, and obviously we're aware, you're probably aware, we have pollution incidents as well that happen. Sometimes that's not from boats, it's from other sources, often tributaries that come into the waterway. We've had some unfortunate incidents on the Lee in the last few years, but certainly that is a contributing factor. You can see that from things like the weed, and that's often as a result of the nutrients that are in the water that are coming from places where they shouldn't, whether that's discharged from a boat or worse, people tipping things in that they shouldn't into the waterway. So there is a testing carrying on. I can certainly find out the details, and I'm sure there'll be some information available which I can share with Libby, and you can circulate that afterwards about the water quality in London. I don't have that to hand, I'm afraid, but certainly it's an issue.
Thank you. Pre-bookable moorings as the next. Bernie Gribble says, how many pre-bookable moorings are there at the moment in London, and can this be very significantly increased? Yeah,
so we've got a limited number at the moment. We've got 8 berths that can be pre-booked. There's 6 in Paddington Basin and 2 in Rembrandt Gardens, which is in Little Venice. So as I mentioned, we have already proposals for additional pre-bookable moorings at King's Cross and on the Limehouse Cut and on the Lower Lee near the Olympic Park. So there are some sites we've already identified. I know that I've had feedback from boaters about need for some maybe further out as you travel into London. So there are certainly options we can consider that. The ones we have in central London have proved to be very popular. They have almost fully booked, certainly in the summer months usually, and quite high occupancy in the winter months as well. So that's been quite a success. It's about getting the balance right. So yes, I think there is scope for some more, but we've got to make sure they're balanced off and in the right place, and that we can manage them, because we don't want to put things in that then get occupied by people maybe who haven't booked them, and then you get issues where you're annoyed because you turn up and you can't moor.
One of the people that runs one of the community boats was saying that at one stage there was talk about having some reserved moorings for community boats, because if they're taking a group, I think Victoria Park was one area that was mentioned. If they're taking a group, then there's just nowhere they can stop off and let the children off for a period of time, because there's just nowhere to moor.
Yeah, so yes, in the strategy there are a few places that are identified as potential pick up and drop off points, both for community use and for day trip boats as well. So we can consider additional ones if there's high demand in certain areas. But yes, that's certainly something that we do have a few of those, and we can look at others if needed.
Right. We're still on moorings. The number, this is I don't know if it's the same anonymous attendee or a different one, but the number of commercial moorings has increased substantially, e.g. in the Paddington Arm in recent years. Could the Trust negotiate some additional pro rata residential and visitor moorings with the landowners to even things out?
So there is, in the strategy, we particularly chose a certain number of areas where we thought it would be more appropriate to have commercial moorings. And Paddington's certainly one of those, around the station. So you'll have seen there's a few moorings that we've got restaurant boats, cafe boats. King's Cross is another location I think that's identified. I guess it's about, we have to think about, I've talked about the sustainability of this and how do we fund the things we want to do. The commercial moorings actually generate considerably more that gets reinvested back into the waterways than we can get for some of the other mooring spaces. So it's not that we aren't up for looking at additional mooring sites. So some of the options we're talking to Meridian Waters and Old Oak Park Royale developments of whether there might be more moorings in those locations as well. It's about getting them in the right place and looking at what's the best location. How can we maximize the benefit? Now, clearly we don't want the whole of Paddington or King's Cross to be about commercial boats, so there'll be a balance. So it'll be a mixture of short stay visitor mooring, of pre-bookable mooring, of other mooring space. Even in King's Cross there's a space where we actually did used to have permanent moorings, which were taken out when the start of the developments happened, and it's our intention to put those back. So there will be some places we'll put them back, but it is a bit about getting a balance. And the bottom line is we will get a lot more money to reinvest back in the waterways from some of those commercial moorings, but it's certainly not our intention to make everything a commercial mooring.
Malcolm has come back on the your mention of the Islington moorings. He says, will there be a priority for electrically propelled boats on the Islington moorings with electric points?
So there isn't a priority. It will be a pre-booking, but we are there's terms and conditions linked to that pre-booking. So as I said, not to run generators and engines, but to use the power supply that's available. I think the Islington pilot is actually something we're going to see a lot more of, certainly in urban areas, not necessarily as a pre-book scheme, but in terms of the demand for shore-based power, because we're likely to see over the next 10, 20, 30 years a drive to reduce dependency on diesel generators and engines. And obviously you can't switch to electric boats, for example, if you can't charge up or access points. But even if you don't using electricity for propulsion, people have demands for power they want to use to charge batteries and things on their boats. So no priority at Islington at the moment, but I think we are likely to see measures that try and encourage people to use electric boats or transition to electric boats probably over the next 20 or 30 years. So it's a bit of a longer lead time. There is actually a second scheme being developed in London for electric boats, electric charging points in Camden, just west of King's Cross around Camley Street area, where the council are looking to fund electric bollards on what is currently just 14-day towpath. So that won't be pre-bookable. That will be just a turn up and use type scheme. But I think there's certainly interest across London boroughs and in other urban areas as well about putting in charging points for boats.
Thank you. Helen Whitehouse has come back on the thing about pre-bookable moorings. She says, the last time I booked a place on Rembrandt Gardens, I discovered a hotel boat was using one of the pre-bookable moorings on a regular basis as a turnaround point, i.e. about once every 10 days. Is this fair for a commercial boat regularly do this? And is it still happening?
So at the moment, commercial boats can book the pre-bookable moorings as well, just like holiday hire boats. So they're open to people. They will pay to use them as well. I understand the point, particularly where we've got high demand for them because they've been very popular. So I think, I'm not sure it's necessarily about restricting that boat because there aren't that many holiday hotel boats operating. but certainly I think there's a lot more demand, and so, as I said, additional pre-bookable mooring sites is certainly something that's already in the strategy, and we may look at additional sites as well. But I understand how I can see why you'd be frustrated, but we also need to bear in mind that the people using that hotel boat will probably be different people every time, although the operator is clearly the same. So it's the water space is there for them to enjoy as well. So it's a tricky one, but I think if we provide more pre-bookable space, it should make it easier for people like yourself to find a space.
Thank you. A comment from Roger Stocker about overstaying. Do you have any data on boats that do overstay? Is it a big problem or just a perception?
So it's a very good question. So it depends what you mean by overstay. So if we have data on 14-day overstaying, because the data checker's primary role is to check that people are moving every 14 days. So where people overstay for 14 days or more, then we contact them, we remind them they're overstayed. That's the sort of start of the warning process before it escalates into a firmer enforcement case. But on short stay visitor moorings, we don't have daily sightings at the moment. So it's very difficult to actually tell you for certainty if boats are overstaying. I'm fairly confident that there are boats that overstay on short stay moorings, but I cannot prove it with statistics. And that's one of the challenges of how do we manage those short stay moorings better? Because if we're going to enforce them, you do need that level of detail. You need to be able to cite them on a daily basis to say, okay, this is a 48-hour mooring. We have cited you for 3 or more days. So you've definitely been here more than 48 hours, in which case you can either apply the charge or take some kind of action. But to do that, that's going to require additional staff or volunteers to gather that data. So it's quite a costly exercise. But as I said earlier, it's no good us having short stay moorings if we don't manage them effectively. So that's something we will have to look at as part of this work.
Thank you. We're getting close to time, really, but so I'll just check some of the whether there's other questions I've missed, but just a couple more from John Serracold, who came up earlier. He says, what steps are you taking to improve licensing compliance? And secondly, do you have a sense of boaters' income and circumstances?
So in terms of licensing compliance, as well as the kind of 14-day movement, there's quite a lot in the license at the moment. People will probably be aware we're running a consultation until next week on changes to our license terms and conditions. One of the challenges we face in the license terms and conditions is they're not always easy to apply. They're not always easy to understand in some cases. So the purpose of the consultation we're running at the moment is to try and make them more effective both for us and more easier to understand for boaters, so that we can then apply them more effectively. So there are certain things we have done that we've brought in to try and support the license terms and conditions, like we brought in the improper mooring process last year. So if boats moor dangerously or in inappropriate places, they get warnings, and if they do it again, this can escalate and impact on your ability to relicense your boat. So there are some things we have done, but I will be completely honest that some of the terms and conditions are not easy for us to apply. Hence, we're doing this process at the moment to tidy them up, make them more effective, make them easier for people to understand, so that we can then enforce them better. So I'm sorry if that dodges your question, but I think there's more to be done on that. The second question, what do we know about the income of boats in London? So in short, we're not required to ask this question in terms of licensing your boat. We certainly gather some information from our boater surveys, so employment status, issues around disability or health. We ask their optional questions, but it gives us a sense of what some additional information about boaters in London. We did do quite a big survey in 2016, which is a few years ago now, when we were developing the mooring strategy, which did give us a bit more indication of people's income, the number of people living on their boats. So we don't routinely have that. You know, some people are living on the boats because it's more affordable, so it's not unreasonable to think that some of those people are on lower incomes. Now, although it's not really the trust's responsibility to consider income, we do a lot of work already through our welfare support, through our national welfare officer and our licensed support officers to help boaters who might be in a vulnerable situation, whether that's for a health or financial issue, whatever it might be. So a lot of that work does happen under the radar. You might not see it because it's very one-to-one with boaters. So we will consider potential implications and whether that falls under the welfare work we already do as part of the impact assessment.
Thank you. Couple more. John Gray, it seems a no-brainer that we should have charges for moorings in high demand areas as there is for road parking. Do such charges have to be tied closely to costs occurred by, I presume that's incurred by CNRT?
So the way it's worded in the legislation, it says we can apply for services and facilities. So it is actually quite vague. It doesn't explicitly say that you have to kind of calculate it. I think if we use charging as a mechanism as part of this proposal, we will need to think about, you know, what impact will that have, both in terms of negatives and positives. Because clearly what we don't want to do is make the waterways completely free of boats again. That wouldn't be our intention. We don't want to drive boats off. So we're not restricted in terms of what you might charge, in terms of it has to be fixed to a certain calculation. There are some things where we are tied to that. So if we've talked about electricity bollards. We can't actually charge more than the cost of the electricity on those bollards. So they don't actually make any money, which several people think it's a money-making exercise. It's not a very good one if we want to do that. But in terms of mooring charges, it's not so constrained.
Right, Ivor Captain has come back again with, we've talked about private boats, but there's also no hire boat company within reasonable reach of London, which is detrimental to opening up the city to wider visitor enjoyment.
Yeah, it's a very valid point. And again, you know, that's partly about how getting the balance right. So the environment's there where people might feel they want to and can visit London on a hire boat again, and maybe an operator might want to restart, which we haven't had one for quite a few years, unfortunately.
Right, I think we've got to most of the
Well, if I haven't answered any, Libby, I'm very happy if you want to forward any that might have been missed. I'm happy to provide a written response to those after tonight.
I think we have really captured most things. I know that right at the beginning, Roger asked when was the last boat sighting done, but I think you actually showed that later in the presentation.
Yeah, so boat sighting resumed again in September.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I didn't actually ask that at that time. And then he also asked, do you have a figure of how much the investment income to CRT is from the London and South East region as a percentage of total income from investments?
So in terms of where we get, I'm not sure whether he's referring to boating income or whether he's referring to investment from property or utility income.
Do you have a figure of how much the investment income to Canal River Trust is from the London and South East region as a percentage of the total income from investments?
Well, the short answer is no, I don't have that. And if Roger wants to email me, I'm happy to see if I can extract that. Certainly, I imagine, you know, where we have investments in property, for example, in London, they will generate more. And certainly where we've had utility services using the towpath, there will be significant income from those kind of funding streams. Certainly, we've tried to look at, you know, where the boating income comes from as well. But of course, with continuous cruises, you can't actually tie it down to a particular region necessarily because they move around. But I'm happy to follow that up if Roger wants to email me. He's got my email address. I think we've exchanged emails.
Right. I think we really, I know there's one or two comments. I mean, Dave Chapman has commented that Black Prince operated under the PLA until the PLA banned hire boats exiting Limehouse Lock. But I don't really think we should take any more time now, but we have got all your questions there. So if there's any more, we can pass them on to Matthew to deal with. I'd just like to know when your, because your consultation or this engagement period finishes on the 8th of January, and then there's going to be a consultation document that will come out later in next year.
So it'll be in the new year. So obviously we have to take some time to look at all the comments and start to develop a proposal. When we have a proposal, there will be a full intention is for a 12-week consultation. So there'll be a chance to comment on the detail at that stage. I don't want to give you an exact date because it's slightly fluid, depends on how long it will take us to develop that proposal. But we anticipate, January, February time of starting some kind of consultation.
Right. Well, we'd be delighted, I'm sure. We've had people from all over the country this evening, not just people from London area. You'll gather that partly from the questions, but and it was open to anyone that wanted to join us. And so what I think would be really useful, if you're willing to come back and do another one when we're at that next stage, I think that would be really helpful.
Very happy.
And I'm delighted with the range of questions that have come up and how fully you have responded to them, and I'm sure everybody else is as well. So thank you very much, Matthew, and we look forward to seeing you at the next stage and of this piece of work, which is a really valuable piece of work.
Thank you very much.
For those who are here tonight, we'll next have a webinar on the 25th of January, which is last Monday in January. And at the moment, I'm just waiting for some confirmation on that one. But I can tell you that the one on 22nd of February is going to be called Trade Under Sail, the Past and the Future. So if those of you that are interested in Thames sailing barges, amongst other things, there's a date to look forward to. So it just remains for me to thank everybody for coming. I look forward to seeing you in the new year. And thank you again, Matthew. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.